My name is Łukasz Lipiński. I'm a journalist from Polityka Weekly, a Polish weekly, and I will have a pleasure to be chair of this panel on democracy and conflict, as it was introduced. My wonderful guests here and panelists are Weronika Grzebalska from the Institute of Political Studies, Polish Academy of Science, Edith Zgut-Przybylska from Graduate School from Social Research and Institute of Philosophy and Sociology of Polish Academy of Science, very long names, and Anna Wojciuk from University of Warsaw. This one is short. So even before the war broke in the Ukraine, or Ukraine was invaded by Russians, there was a lot to talk about things which are happening with democracy in our region. As we can see, the leading democratic indexes are falling down. We have political and socio-economic uncertainties, rise of the extremist movements. We are witnessing the reverse of democratization in Europe. So the plan of this discussion was to talk about the complex effects of these processes and on social cohesion, equality, quality of governance, and future of the EU. That's all the subjects we are supposed to touch. I don't know if we can do it in 1 hour. I just want to add that I think a lot was changed because of the external context. And especially the context of war in Ukraine, the first war of this scale in this area of Europe since World War II, and actually conflict which is fully, in certain aspects, comparable with that. We have also a lot of different geopolitical changes which are connected to this conflict. We have changes in economy, and everyone of us is waiting what happened during the winter. We have high inflation, high cost of energy, and all the effects on the society it can have, and it actually has, which could be seen, for example, in elections in Sweden and Italy recently. So, what we're going to start with this process of remilitarization of our states and societies and its effects on the society, and this is the field of expertise of our guest, Weronika Grzebalska. So how do the remilitarized society look like now, and what are the effects of this process for for our society?
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll take a second to thank everyone for being here with us. And I'm a proud GSSR alumna myself. I defended a PhD on paramilitary organizing in here, so it's kind of a wrap-up of many years of research for me to be here today. Well, the question is, of course, a very big one. I would maybe say that, there's so much talk about the so-called Zeitenwende right now when you open any newspaper. The change, the epochal shift in European, especially Western European hemisphere with regards to defense, security, the role of the military in politics, etc. And I actually, from a sociological standpoint, because I ultimately am a sociologist, I would say that we indeed are living in a Zeitenwende. The difference is that in our region, Central Eastern Europe, we have started this shift many years earlier. In fact, in 2014, we've already been halfway through this shift. And it's a very big shift because it's not just about the worsening security environment, the fact that we are now undergoing conventional militarization, arms and personnel buildup, increased defense spending, but it's also a very deeply societal shift. And I wish that more sociologists would be interested in it, simply because it's really radically redefining what it means to be a citizen. It's redefining society-military relations. And ultimately, it's the biggest change since 1989, when we underwent structural demilitarization all across the region. Citizenship no longer contains fighting for your country, and society-military relations were actually defined by post-militarism by huge distance. And all of this is changing in recent years. So I think we will only see the effects of it on our societies. But then, not to talk too long, maybe I'll try to engage with politics of hope, because there's so much like doomsday scenarios all across the media. And I want to talk about at least 3 things that we see already, how this militarization has actually affected our region and democracies in the region in a more, let's not say positive, but paradoxically beneficial way. So the first aspect, as you probably all know, is the way securitization has weakened, if not undermined, the illiberal international. In other words, the fact that upon finally being confronted with the pro-Kremlin drift of Orban's Hungary, the Law and Justice Party had to part ways with its illiberal partner. And this has weakened the strength of the illiberal international. And I would argue that it would have never happened because, of course, law and justice politicians knew about the pro-Kremlin tilt of Orban for very many years. They just chose to not securitize it. They chose to not treat it as a threat to Poland's national security. And now, with the full-scale invasion of Russian forces in Ukraine, they did securitize it, and I think it was it had quite a potentially beneficial effect for all of us in Europe. The second paradoxically beneficial effect lies in how state-led militarization in our region, which started in 2014, has actually worked to de-radicalize, in many ways, our societies. It's a controversial take, but let me go along, follow through with it. So I was actually studying paramilitary groups around the time of the direct aftermath of the annexation of Crimea. And that's the time when paramilitary groups and different militias and vigilante groups were popping up all across Central and Eastern Europe, and many of them had extremely radical agendas. So many of them were actually pro-Kremlin or had ties to very extremist political parties and figures. And the point is that they were able to harness those kinds of grassroots pro-defense sentiments that were growing in societies at that time. So oftentimes people would end up in those groups not sharing their agenda, but just because they were the only groups that actually let people, in this case, let's say mostly young men, actually engage in this. And once our states started this state-led militarization process, for instance, by building territorial defense forces, state-led channels of engagement, this brought these people out of those radical groups. And this is something that, of course, we don't have full research on, but that I know from experts in the region who told me that these processes have been happening. So that's the second potentially beneficial effect of militarization in our region. And the third one, I won't talk about it long because I know you want to talk about it later, but I would say a potentially beneficial effect on gender equality, which is really, again, counterintuitive, because we all think of militarization as something that strengthens kind of male preponderance in our societies. But it seems like when we look especially in the Baltic states, the Nordics, as well as Poland, you actually see the opposite happening. Namely, this rise of new civic societal militarism is actually bringing in a lot more women than before, and we are actually making up for lost time in many ways. Because, for instance, if it wasn't for the current militarization, we would still have to be looking at a very sad 4.7% of women in the Polish armed forces, and this number has grown by 100% since. So there are certain things that I would say, I'm not trying to picture this militarization as, great process, but I'm just trying to help us all think about the new openings, and that it's not all gloomy and it's not the end of everything we hold dear, but it could be a new opening for many things that were kind of stalemated, and we could use it in this sense.
Great, thank you very much. I could fully agree with this point on taking people from the radical groupings, like for example in Poland Konfederacja, which has lost, I think, half of voters. But if illiberal international is gone, I remember a very day when Mateusz Morawiecki was saying that now when Orban is, a supporter of Russia, we cannot cooperate anymore. Then the same day, Ryszard Terlecki, who is much more important in Polish ruling camp, said, "Oh no, we still like Orban very much, and we will cooperate. We will cooperate." So I don't know if all these aspects of policies of hope will materialize, but still, if we are talking about illiberal international and what's happening with it. I mean, one of the main points is what's happening with Hungary. Hungary is in a very difficult position now in the European Union, but we don't know what's happening too much apart from the election times, what's happening there not internationally, but nationally, on the national level inside of Hungary. But luckily we have a specialist on that, Edith Zgut. So what's happening now in Hungary?
Thank you, Łukasz. Many things is happening in Hungary right now, but I'm not gonna allude all of to it. First, let me start by saying that I would also like to thank IFiS and GSSR for having us here. I think these are interesting times in a sense that I think we thought we had a crisis in 2015 in the European Union with the migration crisis, and then we had a lot more different kind of stress when COVID came in. Because it impacted all the angles of our life, and since the 24th of February, it's again a lot more heavier kind of stress. And I think organizing a conference regarding interdisciplinary cross-sectoral cooperation is the best time to do it, because the situation we're going through is just calls for all hands on deck to cooperate, practitioners, academics, journalists, to try to do many things, but first and foremost to preserve what we can preserve from our democratic achievements and prevent further democratic backsliding. This is why I was invited into this panel to talk about the situation in Hungary, which is, I think, indicative when it comes to the nature of democratic backsliding within the European Union, because Hungary became a sort of authoritarian, illiberal kind of laboratory within the EU. And I think what's important is that, and with that I would like to cycle back to Adam Bodnar's keynote speech, because he was trying to give us a broader picture of the nature of democratic backsliding, which is beyond rule of law, a violation, and the former violation of the law. And here comes into the picture my research, because what I'm working on is to show that when it comes to Hungary, but also to a certain extent Poland, the democratic backsliding is not primarily and only defined by formal and legal means. And I'm going to tell you what I mean by that. The very characteristic of the Orban regime is the exploitation of informal power for political goals. I think this is the best way of summarizing it. Yes, the government has amended the constitution 10 times already. It's a very important difference between Poland and Hungary that Viktor Orban has a constitutional majority, so they have been changing the fundamental law all over again and again in order to capture the referees, undermine the judiciary, making themselves in a dominant position when it comes to the media market. And they also waged cultural war on women, on sexual minorities, and so on and so forth. But, and I think that's what, again, makes it interesting within the European Union, the government is very often making these amendments in accordance to the national law. So it's not necessarily violating formally the law. The way how they're undermining democracy is that they're imposing a tremendous amount of chilling effect and coercion on the society throughout informal power. And I'm talking about two different sides of the same problem, clientelism. This is about organizational clientelism and electoral clientelism. So imagine that when it comes to organizational clientelism, clientelist corruption is so prominent in Hungary that practically 12% in the country have been dominating and capturing the most important economic industrial sectors in the last 20 years. And these 12 people, they're all centered around the prime minister. So political decision-making is happening in a very untransparent way with the involvement of people, family members, friends, centered around the head of the executive power in order to exploit the market and the opportunity structures to accumulate wealth, which is unprecedented since since forever. I mean, we haven't seen it ever before, the way how the new elite has been accumulating wealth. But this is only one side of the problem, including that these people are heavily dependent on the executive, on Viktor Orban, which means that, again, a huge difference between Poland and Hungary, that private property is not protected in the country, which means that if there is an oligarch who have been accumulating a lot of wealth, but there is a tension between him and the prime minister, his property can get expropriated. So even though the constitution says that private property is protected, end of the day, it's not. So there is a lot of coercion and dependency structures within the system, but also, not only when it comes to the business elite, but also the society as a whole. So the most deprived strata of the society, and I'm in particular thinking about the Roma people, which is like 10% of the Hungarian society, they're also being intimidated financially throughout different kind of programs, over-politicized state funds, in order to vote for the ruling elite. And an enormous amount of electoral clientelism is also very prominent. So this is not only about, intimidating the business elite, but also the broader society, which end of the day shows that Hungary is like a typical hybrid regime operating very often under the radar of the European Union, because informal power is like a black box. It's very difficult to conceptualize it, especially from the legal perspective, because, I can give you concrete examples later on, because very often it's just not applicable to, for instance, the violation of the European law either. The European Commission knows that there's a lot of problem in Hungary, but they say that, sorry, we cannot launch an infringement procedure because formally you didn't violate any laws. I mean, it's not unconstitutional, you have the constitutional majority, fine. And clientelism is something which is very hard to grasp with rule of law tools. So, long story short, both the quality of governance and both the quality of democracy have been deteriorating heavily in my country. And this kind of nature of power that I just mentioned, it helps a lot to Viktor Orban to stay under the legal radar of the European Union, which also tells a lot about the constraining role of the European Union per se when it comes to, as an external entity, to do something about democratic backsliding in Central and Eastern Europe. Thank you.
That was definitely not the policy of hope this time, but we'll come back to that in the second round. Now we move, as we are talking mainly about countries of our region, we'll try to move a bit to wider areas, because very often when I talk, especially to diplomats, and they starting sort of complaining about Poland being backsliding in democracy, stuff like that, and I say, okay, and Mrs. Le Pen, and Mr. Salvini, and Mr. Trump, Swedish brothers, and actually in every country you can find the same problem or the same forces gathering strength. We've been talking a lot how it works in Poland, but to Anna, Wojciuk, I have a question: why these forces are actually gathering momentum in the Western Europe, and why this strength of this grouping is actually pretty, long-term on a pretty high level.
Thank you, and I would like again to start with expressing my gratefulness for inviting me for this panel, and I would like to also express my gratefulness for the school, because I had amazing time here, and these are my best memories from my all higher education in Poland. So thank you all, and it was really an excellent academic environment for me. So I'm happy to be back here. And regarding the question, so that's true. It's in Europe, it's in the US, it's also outside Europe, it's in Brazil. We are seeing elections in Brazil and very resilient support for Jair Bolsonaro. And sometimes when we read academic literature which tries to explain this phenomenon, obviously there are different theories. A lot of them are supply side theories, which say that those parties, those politicians, they are tricksters. They are very manipulative. They are very talented. in seducing the voters, and that this is actually the source of this phenomenon. There are also a lot of theories which emphasize the impact of social media, and I absolutely agree that social media make this problem bigger, but I do not believe that it is a source of the problem of polarization. And in fact, the polarization which not only puts against each other the groups which have different values, but in my understanding, groups which want to keep democracy and the profoundly undemocratic groups. So for me, the phenomenon which we see, it's not only populism, but it's an authoritarian right-wing phenomenon which is populist. But I think the populism is not strong enough to name it, and I believe it's very important to have correct terms in order to deal with this phenomenon. So if it's only supply side, I think that those politicians are not really doing good things for their voters. If you look at Donald Trump and his tax cuts, they are not really helping voters in Rust Belt in the Midwest. So of course there are these economical phenomena, Marxist phenomena, that these are groups which economically lost on globalization. But I do not think that looking at evidence, you can persuasively argue for those kinds of explanations. If you look at economic policies of those right-wing populists, they are not really helping their voters economically. And to show even more evidence, actually they have very different economic policies. So Brexit was it was for free trade, that actually the EU was limiting the possibilities of Great Britain to freely trade with the world, and actually when they will leave the EU, there will be more possibilities for free trade. Donald Trump is the opposite. He's against free trade and he wants to have a kind of mercantilist economy. So if you go into the details, which we don't have time, actually you will find a lot of very different economic policies and very often not serving the voters. So you may ask yourself, maybe the voters are not rational. Why they are supporting those parties? Is it that the manipulative skills of those politicians are so great that they are able to persuade voters to support again and again those parties? And yes, sometimes they are losing, like Trump lost, perhaps, hopefully Bolsonaro will lose. But these are not strong losses. These are very close elections, and looking at the quality of policies those parties deliver for their voters, actually, rationally, you would expect support for those parties to decrease. If you look at COVID policy in the United States and in Brazil, it was horrifying for the exact voters who supported those politicians. So is it manipulation, or there is another phenomenon? So together with my colleague Maciej Kiślowski, we have a piece which hopefully will be published in a couple of months, and actually we claim that it is a demand-side phenomenon. There is a genuine demand for those parties, and actually that they are delivering what is expected. So it's not that they are tricksters, that it's not that they are manipulating, they're delivering what is expected from them in things which are important for the voters. And we believe it is dismantling certain egalitarian structures which were producing loss of privilege of certain groups. And actually, those structures have been developed gradually since at least Second World War. And the development of arguments behind those structures against discrimination, against unearned privileges, actually went so far that actually in the democratic debate, those forces can no longer win, that they are losing arguments. And that is why they became profoundly anti-democratic, that they started to believe that you have to get rid out of the system because in the democratic game you can no longer win. So we believe this is the profound explanation of this phenomenon, and we offer a lot of examples and additional arguments to support it. So to sum it up, I believe there is genuine demand, and we may think that they are incapable, that those politicians they are not delivering, they're just manipulating. But in our view, actually, they are answering to the genuine demand, and they are delivering what is expected from them. Thank you.
Very interesting. We had the first round, now we'll have the second round, but before we jump into the second round, I say that if there is anyone who already wants to make a point or ask a question, you're very welcome, and you can jump in at any stage of this discussion. So if there's anyone at the moment? No? So actually I'll jump in and change the scenario of our debate, because when you talked about this, anti-systemic or anti-democratic party deliveries, there are two thoughts or theories which came to my mind. One is actually theory that these parties sort of pushed the agenda from the real economic interest into the absolute values, because it's easier to polarize society when they're discussing about absolute values, because there is no compromise on that. There is no compromise on abortion, on nation, defending the state. How does it sort of interfere with your research? And another, it's a paper of Mikołaj Cześnik, who actually proved that in Poland the nationalist right delivered, but delivered for its voters in terms of money, prestige and power. They think that they are gaining, but the difference between this party and the other parties which were in Poland in power is that they are not even hiding, but they're only sort of doing things in the interest of the electorate, not, the whole nation. Many parties used to say, we're doing this for the Poland, and now the ruling party says, no, we were doing it for our voters. I mean, 50 plus vote for us. Let's pay some additional, let's put some additional streams of money in this direction. What do you think about these two aspects of that?
So if you want to look at particular cases, it will differ. Yes. So in some countries you have welfare transfers, but you have a lot of countries with those type of policies where there are no welfare transfers. And so I think that this is not a part of the core of this phenomenon. I believe that they can have various strategies. And the test for our theory will be, it's coming soon with the elections, where the party will no longer be able to deliver that much on the side of welfare. And for all those who thought that then the support will completely collapse, I think that the welfare programs have, with inflation, and they haven't been updated for many years, so the genuine value for those programs is not as high as 6 years ago. And there are not that many new things coming. There are economic problems, and the support for law and justice is very resilient, given what they are doing and what quality of policies they are delivering. And for me, it's a puzzle why it's so resilient, because the voters got the welfare benefits, and I don't think they can reasonably expect a lot more from this party in upcoming years, and still they are loyal to the party. So why this support is so resilient? And when you look at Brazil, It was expected that Bolsonaro will lose by, I think, 17%. By 11 percentage points, it was underestimated. This support is much higher than it was thought. And we will see, but if we are correct, also our theory would produce prediction that actually in Poland you can as well expect very resilient support for law and justice, even if they will not deliver quality policies because of other reasons, those cultural reasons, which are, in our view, the core of this phenomenon. So in the United States, you don't see Trump really distributing welfare benefits for his voters. Yet there is very resilient support for him among those voters. So yes, in different, there will be differences in different countries, obviously, but if you look generally for the mechanisms which drive these phenomena and resilience of support, I believe it's a different mechanism than purely economical.
I mean, you know, the things you can gather under the government's not only money, but also power or feeling of influence on the power and also prestige, right? So that my grouping is now important than other groupings, or we know much more about what's happening than you know, we know about this QAnon who knows it all, right? So actually not only the economic mechanism are in play here, but there is one, and I'm turning to Edit, one economic mechanism which is actually happening in the European Union. The European Union is trying to block at least a part of funds which are going towards Hungary at the moment. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, how effective this policy can be. Is it a policy which can undermine the Orban's model in any way, or is he as resilient as the other guys at the other side of the pond?
Thank you, Łukasz. Yeah, I think we can safely say that 2022 was so to say, like a turning point when it comes to the explicit constraining role of the EU, because we have seen what we haven't seen before. The European Commission went into withholding money, not only recovery and resilience, that they also launched the conditionality mechanism against the Hungarian government. So they went really as far as they could politically, or at least made these steps. But, and I really don't wish to play this kind of devil's advocate here when it comes to the constraining role of the EU, but I'm pretty sure that it's going to be non-effective at the end of the day, because although the idea is good, I'm afraid it's not going to work in practice. And why it's not going to work in practice has a lot to do with what I said about the nature of power in Hungary. So I'm afraid that they won't be able to have a significant impact on the course of corruption, for instance, in Hungary, for three main reasons. We can, I think, boil it down to three main points. One of them is that Hungary is a hybrid regime, as I said, which is maneuvering informally under the radar of the European Union, which is in contrast to that a very heavily legalized, formalized, embedded kind of structure. So when you have a decision-making structure like this, where most of the decisions are being taken consensually, it takes a lot of time, and so on and so forth, maneuvering informally makes it like a piece of cake. So what we have been witnessing is that although there are many issues in Hungary, most of the most bearing pressure points are still under the radar of the legal radar of the EU. I give you one example. I think this is one of the most prominent. And this is also a problem in Poland. The weaponization of state advertisement in the media is enormous in both countries. So in Hungary, more than 85% of state advertisement of all goes to three media outlets, which are the least read, and they're absolutely minuscule, but they're disseminating propaganda 24/7, governmental propaganda. The situation is not the same, but it's a slippery slope in Poland, because I've seen some numbers, like when it comes to state advertisement for television channels, 90% goes to two channels, TVP and Polsat. And TVP takes most of them, almost 60%. So this is really huge. So this is an existing phenomena, which is obviously out there. And there have been many notions initiated from Hungary. We have been witnessing it for 12 years. So organizations turned to the European Commission. So please do something about it, because end of the day, it has a negative impact on the integrity of the elections. It's not just about media freedom, it's about elections. End of the day, it's about the quality of democracy. And after 10 years, they have been sitting on this kind of decision for many years, the Commission said that we can't do anything about it because none of these governments are formally violating the European law. We know this is problematic, we see that, but we cannot bridge the gap, legal gap, which is between what's happening in the practice and what's in the law. And this is happening despite that the Commission has very clear competencies when it comes to state aid and competition law. So two kind of spheres where the Hungarian and the Polish government is clearly abusing their power. So this is one thing. The other thing is that when it comes to Hungary, EU member states in the Council, they have a very pragmatic economic reason not to penalize Hungary at the end of the day. So the German automotive industry has so many important interests in the country that it's providing 1/3 of the private jobs, for instance. And the government is constantly providing them with very suitable bilateral agreements. The corporation tax is the lowest in Hungary. It's 9% in Europe. I mean, it's really favorable for business environment. So end of the day, why Germany is not moving fast is because it has, economic interest to maintain these kind of opportunity structures which are being provided by the Hungarian government. I think at the end of the day, we can say that this way and throughout foreign direct investment, the European Union is both system legitimizing and system supporting function, because they're both providing the money and they're also legitimizing by keeping Hungary, in the European Union. And the third is, the third factor is another problem which dates back to the accession period, is that in general, the European Union is putting too much emphasis on formal compliances. So this is really a problem where Hungary and Poland was trying to access the EU. They were making the governments to push many democratic market reforms and democracy-related reforms, which would good look on paper. So there was this kind of box-ticking mentality, so that they're going to, fulfill all the criteria, but no one actually put emphasis on law enforcement and the implementation of this law. So it has a lot to do and contributes a lot to systemic corruption, clientelist corruption, and clientelism in these countries, because it created favorable environment to this phenomena. And the problem is that the Western Balkan countries, which are lining up to join the European Union, they're having almost the same structural problems. And I'm afraid that the European Union is making all over and over and over the same problem by focusing on box ticking on paper, but not the implementation. And very shortly, just because I don't want to avoid your question, I think the conditionality mechanism it's part of the power game. I mean, they have to show that they're moving towards this direction, that they're cornering Hungary, so that it's going to change things. And the problem is that the government initiated 17 legislative changes to undercut corruption, which is, again, going to look good on paper, but in practice, I'm afraid it's not going to change the course of systemic corruption. So I'm not optimistic about the constraining role of the EU, and I'm afraid that this is not going to make a big change, this one particular tool, as you asked the question about. Thank you.